Those are some premises about human nature. Can be a little dark. But let's also talk about some premises when it comes to helping other people. Because as ministers and as family members and friends, we have to understand certain things. The first thing that we have to understand is you cannot save another person. There is nothing you can do, nothing you can say that will save another person. At the end of the day, that person is going to make his or her own decisions. Follow me? That person may come to you looking for help, but at the end of the day, father or deacon or any one of us goes away from that person, and that person is making his or her own decisions. So if you have a Messiah complex, if you think it's your job to try to save that person, got news for you. There is no saving that person. There's only one person for whom you can be responsible, and that is yourself. When mothers come to me with all of the distress of their children having left the church, which for some mothers is considerable, right? I am sorry, but that child is going to make his or her own decision, and whatever he or she decides is not on you. The reason I use that example is because in the Mexican culture, there are mothers who do not go to communion because their children have left the church, or their children are living in sin, living with another person but not married, and the mother will not go to communion because the mother believes that it's her fault. So the first premise that we have when it comes to helping other people is, you know what? Your children are going to make their own decisions. Your parents are going to make their own decisions. Your husband or wife, your spouse, your co-workers, your neighbors, they're going to make their own decisions. There's only one person at the end of the day whose decisions you can make, and those are your own. How is that for a bit of powerlessness?
But sometimes when they hear that, you know, I in counseling, are you saying I'm turning them loose? No. Are you saying that I should just let them do whatever they want? No, that's not it. You know, I mean, it's very hard for people.
Let's come back to that. One of the strongest verses for me for parents in the entire Bible is Psalm 127, verse 4. We'll come back to it later this evening. What does Psalm 127, verse 4 say? Children are like arrows in the quiver of the warrior. Think about that for a moment. Children are like arrows in the quiver of the warrior. The quiver, that's the container in which we put our arrows. Okay, so our children, we hold our children close as parents. They're in the quiver. For 18 years they're with us and we're carrying them around, more or less. But there comes a time when we take the arrow out of the quiver, and what do we do with it? We let it fly. And you know what? Once you let go of that arrow, got news for you. You have no more control over that arrow. That arrow may go straight, praise the Lord. But you know what? Once you've done what you can do as a parent, and once you've let go, if that arrow veers off into the wind, as sad as that makes us, we've done what we can do, and ultimately that person is going to make his or her decision, which is one of the most painful things as persons in relation to other persons, right? When we see them making decisions that we shake our head, we scratch our head and say, that is just the dumbest thing. Why is this person doing this? Right? Why is this person saying or doing this? This is not good for this person and for his or her health and his or her future. But you know what? It is their choice. At the end of the day, I can choose what I'm going to do and what I'm going to say, but what other persons say and do is beyond my control. And I can speak with them about that and how their actions and their words impact me and make me feel. But at the end of the day, they're going to choose their own words and their own actions. The only person from whom I can be responsible is myself. The only person in the end whom I can save, if we want to use a word like that in religion, is myself. That's tough because when people come to us, especially certain personalities, next we're going to talk about different personalities. We're going to talk about the helper personality. There are certain people who are great teachers and nurses and mothers and nannies, etc., because they are excellent at helping people. The challenge is, how do we divorce ourselves from that at the end of the day? Because our drive is to help, help, help. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, life happens and people do what they do. Another premise, when people come to you in any situation where they're looking for advice or counseling, they're not always looking for the answer. I say that because guys especially tend to be problem solvers. We'll talk about this next week when we talk about gender differences. As men, when someone comes to us, we tend to think about, okay, he or she has a problem, how do I solve it? Women often have a different perspective from which we can learn. That is, you know, it's more than anything just listening and relationship. When people come to us for counseling, for instance, they're not always looking for answers. And in fact, we have to be careful about giving answers because our answers may not be their answers. Maybe instead of giving them our answers, it's best to help them come to their own answer. Instead of telling them what they should do, well, you should do this. Be careful. Maybe we should listen and help them figure out what they might do and what the possible consequences of that might be. Another premise, if someone comes to you, it's not your job to solve his or her problems and or challenges, but instead, maybe just to give another perspective. He or she is seeing whatever it is from one perspective. Maybe you can help him or her to see it from another perspective. Maybe that's from the perspective of faith, right? What do the scriptures say about people in those sorts of situations? What does the church say? Maybe it's from the perspective of psychology. Okay, a person's going through something. Okay, what can we learn from other disciplines like psychology that might help that person? And so part of this course is simply arming ourselves with more knowledge so when people come to us, we can better understand why it is that he or she might be thinking what he or she's thinking, feeling what he or she is feeling, saying or doing whatever he or she is saying or doing. So part of this course is going to be understanding, for instance, why it is that certain personalities do certain things. Another premise, as I'm fond of saying, don't should on me. Don't should on another person. That word should, or ought, or need to, don't use those words when you're talking to other people. Well, I think you should. No, don't go there. Well, I think you ought to. Well, I think you shouldn't. Well, I think what you need to do is, what's happening in those situations is we're taking the responsibility off of them, and suddenly they're doing something because you said that they should be doing something, so now who's to blame?
Yeah.
You are.
You are.
Follow me?
Yeah.
And unless you know their situation entirely, as well as they know their own situation, then we've got to be extremely careful about saying should. Because it takes the responsibility off of that person, and I just put it onto myself. Well, Father, you told me to. Father told me I should do such and such. Oh, no. Not this, Father. Follow me? I'll listen to you. I'll help you to think through a situation. I'll help you to think through various alternatives and what those consequences might be. But at the end of the day, I am never going to tell you what you should do. Because then you can come back and blame me for however that went. And I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to sleep at night with that. So, as I'm fond of saying, don't should on other people. Instead, the challenge becomes, how do we help those people to come up with the solutions themselves? Also remembering that we're not professionals at this, not even Father Jamie. So in graduate school, we did study various courses on helping relationships and on pastoral counseling and on spiritual direction. Does that make me the world's expert in these sorts of things and on every situation where people will come to me? Heck no. We need to recognize there are other people with expertises in these things, and sometimes it's out of my league. So if I see something that suggests that what's going on is maybe some mental illness, say. If it's true, I've heard that the symptoms of mental illness manifest themselves in 1 out of every 4 persons during any given year. How frightening is that? That means that 3 of us in this room this year are going to experience symptoms of mental illness. This is a serious challenge for us as a church, because how do we, as brothers and sisters, support one another, support our family members and friends during these moments? Think about your family. If your family is 4 people or larger, statistically, it's going to happen. So recognize that there are other professionals out there. There are psychologists and counselors, people with whom we can speak and can help to understand what's going on. There are psychiatrists. What's the difference? Psychiatrists work in medicine. They prescribe medicines to be able to help us out. We have to recognize sometimes that sometimes when people say things to us, that person could be saying something to us because the chemicals in his or her brain are perhaps not in balance today. It's simply part of who we are as complex machines, as human beings. Sometimes when the chemicals in a person's brain get out of whack, I've had them come to my office before thinking that they are superheroes and are here to save the world. That's a time to get them help. Follow me? My sitting down and offering them pastoral counseling at the end of the day is not going to help them to think more clearly about who they are so much as them getting the medical help, getting the medications and or professional help that they need to work through that. So we need to recognize our own limitations. If you have a family member or friend who's going through something and there's some sense that you're getting that this is more serious, then we need to be able to know who it is that we can turn to help get them the help that they need. And another warning, simply we need to know that sometimes people, to justify the way that they see things, will come to you, and you see this in families and in friends and among coworkers all the time. We call it triangulation, simply meaning I see something a certain way, so and you disagree with me? Okay, so let's go ask Father Cleophas. Father Cleophas, who's right? That puts him in a tough situation. Why is it triangulation? There are three people involved, right? Deacon Angelita and I are having this disagreement. We see something totally differently, right? I go to Deacon Cleophas, Father Cleophas, Father Cleophas, because it concerns Deacon Angelita. Who's right? Tell her I'm right. Tell her that she should see it as I see it. We laugh, but in pastoral counseling situations, that's a lot of what we see, right? My son or my daughter just did this. Father or deacon, could you please help him or her to understand? Right? To see it from my perspective. Tell him or her that this is wrong. That's called triangulation. Wait a minute. Those are difficult situations to be in, but we need to recognize as ministers that sometimes we're put into those sorts of situations, often among family members. Because the parent will come with the child, whatever is happening, and the parent is looking for help, essentially, but often the way that it comes out is in a way that it's almost pitting one against the other. Let's pause there for perspectives, comments from our own experiences. Is any of this ringing true? Marisela? Loud voice?
This is everyday life.
But it's like everyday life, she says. Marisela, loud voice?
It's active listening skills. That's what I practice every day on the phone. Because basically, I mean, you have to let them talk sometimes, even though you don't want to hear what they have to say. Because you don't want to hear the whole story or anything like that, but sometimes that's all they want to do is just talk, so you let them talk for 2 to 3 minutes. And then you basically summarize it in just like 3 or 4 words, and that's it.
So Marisela says it comes down to active listening. A lot of this comes down to active listening. Is part of your job, you're on the phone a large part of the day?
Yes.
Listening to people? And sometimes, let's just be honest with ourselves, we would rather be doing other things than listening to this person right now. Amen?
Especially when they're ranting and raving and yelling.
Especially when emotions are high, they're ranting, they're raving, they're yelling, whatever. I mean, there are just certain people, they open their mouths and we're ready to turn them off right now. Part of our job in those situations is what? It's simply listening. I have found that in my own ministry as a priest all these years, when people come to me to talk, part of my responsibility is simply active listening. Let's come back to that concept and unpack what it means to be an active listener in just a moment. Before we come to active listening, any other comments from our experiences?
What was that?
Joe?
1 out of 4, give me that.
So there is a statistic, and it's all online. You can easily Google it, that 1 out of every 4 people, I believe this is from the American, I don't want to quote the wrong source, but it's essentially, psychologists tell us that they are able to diagnose various conditions within the human condition, and that within the course of any year, they suggest that 1 out of every 4 people suffers the symptoms of a mental illness. It's important for us who work in religion simply because some of those mental illnesses that they have fancy words for have certain symptoms that manifest themselves in religious ways. And so, for instance, people who are extremely scrupulous about the sins that they've committed, I have a feeling psychologists could have another word for this, right? They're so fixated on how bad they are and how sinful they are, and they need to confess all their sins, right? Is this normal and healthy, really? Or are there other words that we might use for those sorts of behaviors?
One of the most difficult things for children when they experience the first time theodicy, they're born with everything's going to be great and wonderful, a lot of love, and then when the first experience that the world is not as nice as it's, that is very hard for children, especially in elementary school when we work with them. And wow, it's tough for them. They say, God says that everything's going to be fine, that He does everything, and here it is, somebody dying, my mother's got cancer or something. Oh, it's so difficult for them to go through that. Or bullying, yes, or being put down by other people.
I suspect all of us can think back to our childhoods and think of various experiences that very much influenced us at that time. And if we don't work through these eventually, we continue to carry them around as on our shoulders, comes a point at which we have to think through these situations, right? Perhaps through pastoral counseling, think through these situations, try to make sense of them, and get beyond them. Whether some of the examples you have, whether that's death, whether that's illness of a loved one, whether that's abuse. Statistically, I'm led to understand 1 out of every 4 girls is sexually abused by the age of 18, 1 out of every 8 boys. Those are serious statistics. Bullying, how do we get past those experiences, especially those experiences we had as children that held us bound for so long?
Well, the thing too is that if you have experienced, say 1, 2, or 3 of these things as a child, you somehow get through this. Then you have children, and someone is going through that. And so that's going to make us really, it depends on how you have dealt with it as to how you are going to help your child deal with it.
Yeah. Henry Nouwen, a spiritual writer of the 20th century, had a great term for that. He referred to it as the wounded healer. There is something very beautiful about that. Those who are often most healing in this world are those who know that wound themselves, right?
I've been through it.
Who have been through it, who know what you're feeling in some way, right? We have to be careful to say I know what you're feeling, because we can never crawl inside that person's skin and know what they're feeling.
No.
But maybe we've been through a situation that is very similar to theirs, right? So that, for instance, if it's true that 1 out of every 4 people has suffered from some experience of mental illness in the past year, whoa, maybe there are people close to me whose families are not so different from my own, whose struggles I might be able to identify with in some way.
What it's like the death of a child, like I lost my oldest son, and I know what it took for me to get through that, and then just recently someone else lost their son through suicide, and I know what you're feeling. You're going through the anger, you're going through this, you're going through that, but they did not want to have contact with anyone. So it was very difficult to help this person get through this, except to say, I am here to listen.
And there's something beautiful about that. In many situations, Father Jamie, as much as I love him, he may not have been in that experience of having lost a child, for instance. Follow me? So those who've gone through that experience are able to reach out in those situations and help
to
her
listen
healing in
and
a way that
understand the
others.
anger, the fury,
There you go.
because you go,
There you go.
woo, you go through a lot
Father
of things.
Roy We all know Father Roy's story. It was through a similar experience with his daughter, Michelle, who is lost, who was murdered in a case of domestic violence. You know, when you go through situations like that, and you feel all the feelings that accompany that from the moment that you find out about that through the coming days and weeks and months and years, because these things are nothing that we leave behind easily, that helps us to be better healers. Or in the words of Henry Nouwen, we are wounded healers.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful about that.
When someone is talking to you and telling you a problem they have or whatever it is that they, they need you to listen. And after listening, if you can validate what they're saying and give it back to them in words that will make them feel like you understand what has happened, what's going on with them. Even though you maybe never experienced it, you are validating what they're saying.
And that comes back to that skill of listening. How do we listen to that person in such a way that they felt listened to and understood? And we're going to come back to some of that this evening, some of those skills.